In this video, I want to talk about role-playing games, board games, and RPG/board game hybrids. I've been doing a lot of reviews recently, and one of the things I talk about is if this game has rules like a board game but feels like an RPG, and I wanted to define, at least in my mind, what these things mean. So here we go. Role-playing games, board games, hybrids, how are they similar? More specifically, how are they different? So I'm going to start with the rules. In a board game, the rules explicitly define the entire experience. All right, when you think about a game like Candyland, which is actually an activity in my mind, not a game, but when you think about a game like Candyland, the rules explicitly define the experience and that you're going to draw cards, move your person forward based on the color of the squares on the card that you drew. You can't jump into the black licorice forest in Candyland because that is not explicitly defined in the rules. Maybe another example would be helpful. If you think of the game Ark Nova, which was recently on my top 10 board games of all time list here in 2025. In Ark Nova, you're building a zoo, right? So you're putting out enclosures onto your map, you're adding animals to those enclosures, you're partnering with universities to get more bonuses, but at no point can you decide to raise admissions just because you want to in your zoo. That's not defined in the rules, so you can't do it. So that's how I think of board game rules, is the entire experience is explicitly defined in the rules. Whereas an RPG, or role-playing game, they have gray areas. They define a rules structure that should be able to handle most situations that come up in the game. However, the situations that come up in the game are not explicitly handled by the rules. So for example, in Dungeons and Dragons, if you decide that you want to jump over a pit and fall, the rules might explicitly state fall damage, so that's covered. But if you want to jump into a pit that has mud on the bottom, for example, so it's not like hitting hard ground, it's like really soft mud, almost like quicksand, the rules might not cover that, but the rules do give a structure. And so the dungeon master or the game master, they can sit down and say, okay, given the rules I have in front of me, I can resolve this situation even though it's not covered explicitly in the rules. And to me, that's the main difference between board games and role-playing games, is that board games explicitly cover the entire scope of gameplay within the rules, whereas the role-playing game does not. So that's the first main difference. The second main difference is one in story. Similar to the rules, a board game, the story that's told in a board game, is explicitly covered within the scope of the game itself. So if you think about Eldritch Horror, this would be another game on my top 10 games list. Eldritch Horror is an adventure game where you're going all across the country trying to gather clues and fight monsters to prevent one of the old ones from returning. To do this, you're drawing cards, right? And the cards are story cards that tell you events, but there's a mechanical piece to that that allows you to continue the game, or that tells you more about the game. However, the entire scope of the story is included within these cards. And so you're never going to be in a situation where more of the story is told that is not included in the cards. If you compare that to an RPG, of course, RPGs have wild, varying story moments no matter how you play them. You could sit down with a module in front of you and start running the module. Inevitably, something's going to happen where the characters experience something that's not explicitly covered in the module. This happened to me recently when I was running In Search of the Unknown, when my characters decided to tunnel through the floor to see if there was caves below. They were right, but they made a lot of noise and had a very dangerous combat because of that. So that's another main difference to me. Board games, the story is covered in all of the game pieces, whereas in role-playing games, story elements can flow in and out of the game based on the game itself, and you're going to get into situations where you are experiencing story elements that are not explicitly covered in the rules or within the story module. Now, the last part is play and feel, and this is the toughest one to define because it's a little ambiguous. There are games that play like a board game, all right? Most board games, for example, play like a board game. And then there are games that play like a role-playing game, like most RPGs. But there are games that are board games that play like an RPG, and Star Drifter, a recent review I did, falls into this category, all right? That game is a game that has board game mechanics, but when you sit down and play it, it feels like a role-playing game. So this is something I use when I do reviews, because people need to know, hey, am I playing a board game or a role-playing game? But what does it feel like I'm playing? And Star Drifter, in my mind, is a board game. because all of the rules and story are explicitly defined within the game book. However, it feels like you're playing an RPG. On the other hand, there are certain RPGs that could feel like board games. It's a good one. Probably should have came up with a good example. Of course, I can't come up with one right now at the top of my head, but a lot of board games that have very mechanical conflict resolution mechanics, especially if resources are exchanging hands. Monster of the Week might be a good one. Not really. These are games that are role-playing games, but there are aspects of it that might feel like a board game. And of course, if you want to know and learn how to play or learn about a game, it's important to know that. So we've talked about rules, we've talked about story, and we've talked about the play and feel of the games. Where does a hybrid game come into this, right? Because we have board games, we have role-playing games. What does a hybrid game mean? And to me, a hybrid is one that has some of the elements of one of these of a board game, but some elements of a role-playing game. And so it might have rules like a board game, but storyline like a role-playing game, or vice versa. Or, like Star Drifter, it might have the rules and the story of a board game, but it might feel like an RPG. That is how I would define a hybrid, a game that has some elements of a board game, but also some elements of a role-playing game. So I hope this discussion has been helpful for you. I hope it's going to be helpful for future games that I review here on the channel, and of course games that I make. Please let me know if you agree with me. If you disagree with me, let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.